Boa noite, pessoal, a todas e todos os presentes aqui. Um prazer receber vocês no auditório do IDP, retomando as nossas atividades presenciais, ainda no modelo um pouco combinado de híbrido e presencial. Hoje a gente tem a honra e o prazer de lançar a Cátedra Celso de Mello, uma iniciativa para trazer professores visitantes no Brasil, para ficar com a gente no IDP. E a gente vai ter hoje a palestra do professor Christopher Thornhill, e, né, um dos maiores nomes da sociologia do direito e do direito constitucional. Vou passar primeiro a palavra para o ministro Gilmar Mendes, cumprimento aqui na mesa, para falar um pouquinho da cátedra. Na sequência, eu apresento o professor Thornhill para vocês e a gente ouve a palestra dele. Ministro Gilmar, por favor.
Boa noite, professor. Boa noite a todos que estão aqui presentes. Esse é um projeto que nós já desenvolvíamos e já desenvolvemos há algum tempo. Mas, como todos sabem, tivemos aí a pandemia e toda essa interrupção de atividades, e que nós queríamos ter a presença de nomes de grande relevo no direito e no estudo do direito, de ciência política, da sociologia, e para tratar de temas relevantes, que são relevantes no mundo e são relevantes também no Brasil. E nós entendíamos isso nas discussões que tivemos lá atrás, com o João e com os demais colegas do IDP, que também a gente deveria pensar numa adequada homenagem a alguém que representa bem esse pensamento comparatista, que, de fato, se dedicou e marcou a história da nossa Corte Suprema, do Supremo Tribunal Federal, por tantos anos, e pensamos, então, que seria uma forma justa de homenagear o ministro Celso de Mello, criando essa cátedra, com esse propósito já descrito inicialmente pelo João, de, eventualmente, todo ano, nós esperamos, ter uma eminente figura do direito aqui, por um tempo, pesquisando, discutindo conosco. E nós estamos tendo, acredito, professor Christopher Thornhill, nós estamos tendo a sorte de abrir, de inaugurar esta palestra e esta cátedra com a sua presença. Acho que não poderíamos ter um melhor nome no direito, um melhor nome na ciência política, na sociologia, do que o seu nome, para que nós pudéssemos inaugurar essa cátedra e essas atividades. Todos já viram, inclusive o professor Christopher Thornhill lançou uma obra no Brasil, né, Crise Democrática e Direito Constitucional Global, e recentemente nós vimos, ele escreveu até um artigo sobre um tema polêmico, né, nessa questão, e mereceu grande destaque num grande jornal brasileiro, que foi a Folha de São Paulo, trazendo uma abordagem diferente sobre uma temática que é muito discutida no mundo. Então, não quero mais cansá-los com as nossas palavras iniciais. Nós queremos ouvir o professor, certamente o João vai só.
Obrigado, ministro. Bom, o professor Christopher Thornhill, ele é professor da Universidade de Manchester e também é professor visitante em diversas universidades ao redor do mundo, conferencista, consultor, tem um profundo conhecimento da Iberoamérica, do Brasil, e escreve sobre esse tema tão fundamental que é a interface entre direito e política. Desde o início do século XX, desde o Jelinek, passando pelo Konrad Hesse e pelos clássicos do constitucionalismo, a grande discussão é se as questões constitucionais, como elas são esse híbrido de discussões políticas e jurídicas. E o professor Thornhill, ele é mais do que capacitado, com uma formação interdisciplinar, para avaliar esses aspectos, inclusive na ordem global, do constitucionalismo global, num tema que hoje está mais do que na agenda, que é warfare e o direito constitucional. Professor Thornhill, uma honra tê-lo aqui no IDP, por favor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. These extremely kind words that have been said about me. I understand most of Portuguese, not every single word, but I understand when people say good things and bad things about me. Most of this, I think, was very, very favorable.
Mostly good things.
Mainly good.
Mainly good things.
So, just a couple of words before I start to speak. Thank you for coming this evening. It's very nice to see you. First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much to my colleagues at the IDP for welcoming me here, and not only to immediate colleagues, but to all the people that I've met in the corridors, all the students, everyone for being so friendly. It's such a wonderful institution, and it's impossible to imagine a warmer reception. So I'm very grateful to everybody, and it's really, I'm very proud to be here, and it's clearly a very important institute in both in the context of the city and in the context of Brazil as a whole. So thank you very much. I'd also like to say what an honor it is to give the inaugural lecture for the Celso de Mello professorship. He's obviously an extremely important and very respected figure in the judicial and political environment in Brazil. So it's wonderful for me to be able to give the first lecture in his name. And since I arrived here, I've been in conversation with colleagues both in law and international relations. I believe there's an international relations program starting up at IDP at the moment. So the presentation that I want to give, I think rather fortuitously, combines aspects of constitutional law and international relations. I'd like to talk about what seems to me to be one of the most pressing questions, both in constitutional law and in political analysis more widely, and that is about, and not only in constitutional law and political analysis, but I think also in sociology. So I'd like to present a work that crosses between these three disciplines about the relationship between constitutional law and warfare. I'll speak for about an hour. Is this okay? Or yeah. I'd like to use a deep sociological method to look at questions in constitutional law, and also to look at to think about intersections between international relations and constitutional law. So the lecture is intended as part of a longer sociological analysis and defense of constitutional rule. And before I start, I'd just like to set out some definitions that frame the analysis I want to present. And that, as a definitional clarification, I understand constitutional rule as government which is supported by a text, legal text, that allocates powers within the state, that protects certain rights for citizens, and that guarantees some degree of popular representation. So on this definition, a fully evolved constitution is a constitution that allows full democracy. Some people dispute the relationship between constitutional law and democracy, but on my definition, a constitutional government is a democratic government. And a democratic government is a government which is based in full and equal voting for all men and all women in competitive elections. This is the definition of democracy and the definition of constitutionalism. In other words, a constitution frames a political order that is based in certain constitutional rights and the exercise of popular sovereignty. And there is no constitution that does not contain a strong representative aspect. Of course, not all constitutions were fully democratic, but from the outset, from the first development of constitutional law contained a normative imperative, which is popular representation. Popular representation was initially very limited, and most constitutions only became fully democratic after 1945. But the normative claim to popular representation is always implicit in constitutional law. In addition to these definitions, the lecture or the presentation is based in two historical assumptions. First assumption is that democratic constitutional rule gradually established itself as a model of government globally after 1945. From that time onward, constitutional government progressively became a global norm, or at least a global expectation. There were very few constitutional democracies before 1945. There were very many constitutions, but full democracy, full constitutional democracy only became widespread after 1945. The number of fully developed democracies before 1945 is very small. And second, my claim is that after a second wave of democratic constitution making began around in the 1980s and continued after that time. So the two waves of fully democratic constitution making. There are many constitutions much earlier that had moved towards a higher level of democracy, but fully democratic constitutions were created in two waves after 1945 and then from the 1980s onwards. And the second wave of constitution making has in some respects run into trouble. And this is what I'd like to think about today. So in this lecture, I want to think about constitutional democracy in big terms, but I want to think about, firstly, how constitutions developed. And secondly, I want to think about the outlooks for constitutional democracy and the problems for constitutional democracy today. And this is framed by the body of literature which is concerned currently with questions about constitutional erosion or democratic crisis. I would like to advance the broad theory that if we wish to defend constitutional law and understand the challenges to it, we also need to understand its social and historical origins. So I'd like to move on this basis. Now, to start with, to understand the social, or to address the social origins of constitutions, we can in broad terms observe that constitutions contain three separate dimensions. Constitutions have developed around three different sets of provisions, providing protection for citizens. And each of this is connected to a particular construction of citizenship. And these dimensions in constitutional law are broadly as follows. Constitutions contain provisions for legal procedure, so procedural rights for citizens, rights of due process, equal treatment under law, access to courts, and so on. And at this level, citizens are constructed as legal subjects in constitutional law. But constitutions also contain political rights, as I mentioned before. They contain an imperative based in the assumption that government is legitimate if it establishes procedures for public representation. So constitutions also contain political rights, that is the right to vote, the right to stand for election, the right to enter political associations. And at this level, constitutions construct citizens as political subjects. But constitutions have also developed more recently around social rights, constructing citizens as social subjects. So most constitutions either informally or specifically, establish some rights to welfare resources, social protection, and in particular the right to education, which I understand as a social right, part of a modern welfare state. Now, if we look back across the history of constitutional law, we can see a very striking fact, which is that as constitutions have developed around these principles, each one of these principles had its origins in interstate conflict. And the first principle of constitutional law, the first level of constitutional law, namely that constitutions provide procedural rights, can be identified in the 18th century, actually before the development of modern constitutional law. In that governments in Europe, different governments in Europe in the middle of the 18th century began to establish legal codes, pre-constitutional legal codes, which established procedural rights for citizens, giving citizens some relatively uniform legal personality, providing for access to court, and establishing a very, very crude early form of administrative law. Very importantly, this is connected with the expansion of warfare in the 18th century, as governments had to reach further and further into their societies to recruit soldiers. And the establishment of early legal codes in this form was connected with the process of institutional centralization, in which governments eliminated or began to eliminate the power of the local aristocracy and to impose military duties directly on members of society. But the link between constitutional law and warfare is clearest in the construction of political rights in constitutional law. Indeed, if we go back to the very origins of modern constitutional law, we can see that constitutions developed as military contracts in which governments allocated certain rights to their citizens in order to persuade them to enter military service. So that the early constitutions in revolutionary France contained political rights, rights of representation, but they also imposed military duties. In fact, they imposed a kind of a blood tax on subjects, in which subjects were incorporated within the political system, but they had to perform military service to obtain rights of participation. This was very strongly connected in the first instance to the abolition of serfdom in Europe and the gradual elimination of coercive labor regimes. Individual members of society were taken out of involuntary labor systems, incorporated in a set of constitutional rights as political subjects. But to do this, they had to also act as soldiers. So citizens were transformed into citizens, or subjects were transformed into citizens and soldiers at the same time as part of the same process. And constitutional law administered this process in which people were transformed from peasants, from serfs, into citizens and into soldiers. This took place in Latin America as well at a slightly later time. The independence wars in Latin America were marked by the fact that many patriotic armies recruited from people who were held in slavery, in involuntary labor regimes, and they were emancipated as payment for their willingness to fight for patriotic armies. This was less pronounced in Brazil. It took place in Brazil somewhat later in the Paraguayan War. Obviously, Brazil, the independence process in Brazil was less violent than in other Latin American countries. But if we look at the Caribbean, for example, Colombia and Venezuela, where there was had a central role in the Atlantic slave trade, the mobilization of patriotic armies relied quite widely on the recruitment of slave soldiers, and of course the liberation of slaves was partly recompense for this process. But so the connection between warfare and constitutional law is right at the beginning of modern constitutionalism. It's in the constitutions of revolutionary France. It's in many of the independence constitutions in Latin America. Even in the background, it's present in constitution-making processes in the USA. Although conscription was not established at a federal level in the USA, it was certainly established in different states during the independence period. But much more importantly, if I flick through, oh no, I can't get this to work. To go forward. Yeah. Much more importantly, we can see that this connection between warfare and constitutional law is perpetuated, continued all the way through constitutional history, so that up until 1945, almost every constitution that was created in a social environment which was strongly determined by warfare. Now, this was not a uniform process, but I'd like to say that we can approach constitutionalism before 1945 through the perspective of a typology of military constitutionalism. And I think we can draw up 6 different categories or 6 different types of process in which military conflict led to the creation of constitutional law. First, we can see that some constitutions were created to stabilize a post-bellum political order, a post-war political order, in which rights were guaranteed for social groups that had attained influence because of war, often giving rights to soldiers as recompense for military sacrifice. And many constitutions can be aligned to this process. Many constitutions can be aligned to different types within this typology. These are not absolutely pure types, they overlap. So some constitutions comply with more than one of these types at the same time. But many constitutions belong to this type. Just immediately, we could say the USA Constitution of 1789, the Colombian Constitution of 1821, the French Constitution of 1875, the Russian Constitution of 1906, the German Constitution of 1919, the Austrian Constitution of 1920, the Polish Constitution of 1921, the list goes on. Many belong to this type. Second, we can see that many constitutional laws were created to address the threat of war, so that governments introduced constitutional law, constitutional systems to mobilize their populations in face of external hostility or potential external antagonism. Designing constitutions to expand the foundations of government in society and to mobilize populations more effectively. So again, we can see a number of examples of this. I would say every French constitution from 1793 to 1875. For the purposes of Latin America, the Spanish Constitution of 1812 is extremely important in this respect, which was designed under Napoleonic occupation, and it was intended partly to modernize the army and to increase military recruitment. The Danish Constitution of 1849, the Austrian Constitution of 1867, the German Constitution of 1871, but would all belong to this type. The third type then would be that many constitutions were created through wars of unification, or wars at least leading to the increased geographical integration of a particular state. And wars of this kind, wars of integration, or wars of national unification, usually very close to civil war, that contained elements of civil war. So we could say the German Constitution of 1871, the constitutional order created in Italy between 1860 and 1870, the Colombian Constitution of 1886, the Japanese Constitution of 1889, the Brazilian Constitution, I think, of 1891 can be included in this category, which is, I know Brazil was technically a unified society before this time, but this was really a key moment in a long process of national unification. But then the Polish Constitution of 1921, I would say, is a classic example of this, in that Poland developed after 1918, having lost sovereignty for well over 100 years, and it was unified very rapidly, but through warfare, particularly warfare with Soviet Russia, and the constitution that was created in 1921 was to all intents and purposes, a unification constitution, created in a society which experienced an extraordinarily high level of militarization, in that the number of Polish citizens, men and women, involved in military service between 1918 and 1921 was extraordinarily high, much higher than even during societies in the First World War. So that Polish constitutional law is paradigmatic for much of this analysis. A fourth type is, of course, the simple model, is that many constitutions were simply imposed by occupying armies. So Cuba, 1901, Panama, 1904, Japan, 1946, Italy, 1948, Federal Republic of Germany, 1949, as well as more recent constitutions, obviously in Iraq, Afghanistan, and different regions. The fifth, many constitutions were created in post-colonial settings and through wars of independence, in which constitutional systems resulted from the activities of national liberation armies or insurgent groups, depending on perspective. And they often took shape in societies defined by multipolar conflict with elements of civil war. And we can think of a number of examples of this. I won't go into them all here. And of course, then finally, sixth, some constitutions were simply put in place through military takeovers, often linked to civil war, either high-level or low-level civil war. Many military takeovers didn't result in constitutions, they resulted in dictatorships, but many military takeovers resulted in an expansion of democracy and an increase in some kind of constitutional system. So we could say, here again, I would say the Brazilian constitutional process between 1930 and 1934 could be included in this, with some caveats. The revolutionary process in Bolivia after 1949, Portugal 1974 to 1976 would fit this model. The vital point that I want to make is that up to and including the period after 1945, the constituent power, the driving force behind constitution making, is war. Now, this takes place in many different ways, and there are many different kinds of war. And military units assume different functions in the aftermath of war and before war. But there are very, very few constitutions prior to the 1980s that were not created in military environments. This is, we say in English, this is something which is hiding in plain sight. It's so obvious that we tend to ignore this fact. But it does create some very problematic, have some very problematic implications for constitutional theory and constitutional analysis in the classical sense of the word. In the constitutional analysis, or the drafting of constitutions, is normatively construed as a process in which people project conditions of public good, put in place a legal order to facilitate the administration of government. But at a deeper level, if we look at the growth of constitutional law, it's actually much more strongly connected with the administration of violence. And constitutions tend to take shape as instruments which are designed to stabilize the means of violence in post-conflict situations. And as I said, this is not one simple process. But at this point, I'd like to say something which I'll come back to a bit later. That in most instances before 1945, the function of constitutions in stabilizing the instruments of violence in society in post-conflict situations was not very most constitutions didn't do this very effectively, in that if we look across most democratic constitution-making processes, we can see that most major constitutions didn't stabilize interactions between different groups for very long or very permanently, that they tended really to express very temporary balances between different social groups. And most constitutional situations led to the uncontrollable politicization of antagonisms or interactions between different groups. And up until the aftermath of 1945, most constitutions really were just marked temporary periods of peace, and they ultimately resulted in either low or high level civil war. There are very few processes of democratization, constitutional organization of society that didn't result in repeated civil war. We have to look long and hard to find societies, constitutional systems to which this doesn't apply. And the exceptions to this are usually very small states. Now, the third element of constitutional law that I mentioned before, the construction of members of society as social subjects, is also very closely connected with warfare, just as strongly, really, as the process in which members of society are constructed as political subjects. In that the military contracts formalized in constitutional law usually also resulted in the administration or the allocation of welfare provisions, the construction of social rights for people who acquired citizenship under constitutional law. So members of society also became social citizens because of the effects of war. This took place a bit later than the construction of citizens as political subjects, but there was a slight delay between the development of political rights and the development of social rights in constitutional law. But the granting of social rights usually followed maybe 4 or 5 decades after the allocation of political rights, but both processes were connected to war. And the role of military conflict as a driver or as a determinant of the administration of social rights and the incorporation of social rights in constitutional law is very striking. And that this began particularly in the age of the first development of welfare states in Europe began in the age of high imperialism, as different European countries were in a process of expansion. And the administration of welfare in the first instance was often designed quite expressly to ensure that soldiers were fit to fight. There's an anecdote about Austria, the Austrian government in the aftermath of the Austro-Prussian War. They introduced welfare laws and indeed education reforms soon after the end of the war, because they thought that the soldiers had been too badly educated to fight properly, and that their physical condition was also too poor to engage in effective warfare. Of course, the model for the European welfare state in many countries was created in Imperial Germany, when Imperial Germany was in a process of domestic expansion with the consolidation of the Reich, and was just gearing up also to become a major imperial power with overseas territories. The introduction of the early welfare laws in Britain coincided very closely with imperial expansion, and this can be generalized across European society. But it's really in the aftermath of the First World War that welfare states begin to take off in Europe. And in most cases, the expansion of social rights In the case of some constitutions, social rights were expressly incorporated in constitutional law. The Weimar Constitution, the German Constitution of 1919 is a good example of this. The Polish Constitution, or the Polish constitutional corpus created between 1919 and 1921 is also another example. But the development of social rights at this time was very closely connected to the aftermath of the First World War. And at this time, we could say that the provision of social rights began to become part of the substance of constitutional law. Importantly, though, a point has to be made, I think, about the construction of social rights, which is very similar to the point I made earlier about the original construction of political rights, which is that although social rights were intended to incorporate different social groups within government, and they were intended to solidify forms of social agreement that had developed through war, originally in their first manifestation, their first development after 1918, well, social rights didn't do this very effectively, in that most societies in Europe polarized around attitudes to social rights. So that the early development of welfare states became the primary line of conflict running through European society. So that European societies polarized. We can apply this to much of Latin America as well. It doesn't only apply to Europe, but just taking the European example, the number of societies, or the number of governments that actually managed to stabilize welfare states, which were accepted by different social groups, is very small. I mean, Sweden is the main example, but which was very much a pioneer in developing a welfare state, or developing a social order with strong welfare provision. But most societies in Europe entered a cycle of rapid democratic decline after the middle of the 1920s. And this was usually to do with the fallout around social rights. In most European societies, by the middle of the 1930s, some form of military government had taken form, and in which military organizations were used quite specifically to cut back the welfare provisions that had originally supported the development of democracy. So that some kind of military government, whether it's a pure military dictatorship or fascist government with support from the army, became the order of the day in much of Europe. On this basis, I'd like to just draw an interim conclusion, which is that observed over a long historical period, we can say that the constitutions of modern governments developed essentially as security constitutions, and they were designed to stabilize relations between different social groups in national societies in face of external military antagonism, but often also in face of potential domestic conflict. And as such, constitutions were divided into two parts, or what I would call two sub-constitutions. They developed around political constitutions, which is the formal legal order of government. But they also developed around welfare sub-constitutions, which is the apparatus, the legal apparatus for the administration of social welfare. And both parts of this constitution, the security constitution, reflected the fact that through the development of constitutional law, the military was the origin, the driving force behind the construction of constitutions. And indeed, the military was the most prominent system of integration within society. In most of Europe, citizens, if I could just extemporize for a moment, in most of Europe, contact between citizens and governments was mediated through the army. So the primary contact that people had with government was either through the army or through the education system. But in most of Europe, countries with advanced education systems were also countries that had far-reaching systems of conscription. There are a couple of exceptions to this, but essentially educational reform was at one level separate from the military, but it was also driven by the military. We can see almost invariably with innumerable examples that educational reform and the introduction of far-reaching comprehensive education systems, at least for children, was linked to military reform. So the army, in its different manifestations and through a number of different channels, was the main integration system in society. As I go on to, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm not doing very well with this. Could you? There we are. So, as I mentioned before, I just want to reiterate this point. The connection between the military and constitution making in Europe had a number of very serious and far-reaching consequences for domestic political organization. In that, one important consequence of this connection is that it created social conditions that were always showed a propensity for causing civil war. And the linkage between citizenship and the military gave rise to a series of different factors which induced hostilities and antagonisms within national societies that were very difficult to manage. We can see this in a number of different ways. At one level, we could say that in many European societies from the French Revolution onwards, warfare became a source of legitimacy. So governments legitimated themselves through warfare, and when they were unsuccessful in wars, they tended to collapse. Up until before the French Revolution, when governments launched unsuccessful wars, they came home and everything continued, usually. But governments that lost in warfare after the French Revolution usually collapsed, or at least underwent some form of very far-reaching reform. The militarization of citizenship also had the result that it induced hostility to military service, so that the rejection of military service became a fundamental form of contestation in European societies, but also in Latin America. I mean, Brazil, I think, is a very important example of this. The governments repeatedly tried to introduce military service, and it was rejected, sometimes in military form. I think there was, if I'm correct, there was a famous naval uprising, which was partly induced by the rejection of military service. So this military service of itself created civil instability. Further impact of the militarization of constitutional law is that obviously the army becomes the leading actor in society, so that basic patterns of social integration become connected with warfare. Another outcome of this is that military factions acquire a very prominent position in society, and rivalries within military units prove very unsettling. But the most important thing I think we need to observe in this context is that the construction of citizenship or constitutional law on a military basis meant that social relations themselves became militarized. So that as national societies became more and more militarized around external conflicts, they also became more and more militarized around internal conflicts. And the classic example of this would be, well, two classic examples of this would be Europe in the decades before 1914, where militarization around external threats was very closely connected with increasing hostility, militarized hostility between social groups. But most paradigmatically, the years after the First World War, in which experiences of militarization directed towards other countries were immediately internalized in very brutal forms of interaction, often of a semi-military or a paramilitary nature, between groups within society. So this is just to reinforce the point that I made before, excuse me, it's to reinforce the point that I made before, which is that in the original construction, constitutions providing for political integration and social integration did not provide a basis for government, did not provide a basis on which governments could legitimate themselves. Even more, we could say that there was a military formula at the heart of constitutional law, which invariably unsettled governments that legitimated themselves through this formula. So this is what I would call a military paradox at the heart of constitutional law, that constitutions were created in military environments, but then they were also unsettled or destabilized by the military elements that they contained. I move on now to, can we go into the next point? Move on to a further point now, which is that, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, it's really only after 1945 that democracy becomes a generally accepted and globally recognized expectation. And after 1945, democracy begins to expand beyond a small number of polities, mainly in Northern Europe. Now, this didn't happen overnight, and we can't say that from 1945 onwards, there were, we can identify a large number of stable constitutional democracies, but democracy did begin to take hold after this time. And between 1945 and the late 1960s, democracy became increasingly stabilized in a number of different environments, although still it's a minority form of government. But the key point in this is that this stabilization of democracy coincided with a welfare state revolution. That it's not only democracy itself as a political constitutional form that became widely accepted at this time, it's also the welfare state as a form of social administration. And the consolidation of democracy was almost invariably connected to the recognition of welfare responsibilities as part of a set of constitutional duties. And indeed, the process in which, the period in which political democracy became consolidated between 1945 and the 1960s was also a period, in Europe this is, also a period in which welfare provision, welfare related institutions became more and more robust, reaching further and further into societies. Now, there's one thing I would like to say, I think that this is a key point in understanding modern constitutions and in understanding modern democracy. And it's quite a complex point, but I'll try and make the point as simply as possible, which is at one level, as before, after 1945, constitutions were the results of war. In that universal political inclusion of men and women became an increasingly widespread norm at this time. And this was very strongly based on international agreements that had been promoted during the war itself. But perhaps even more importantly, the rise of the welfare constitution after 1945 was very strongly linked to experiences which had been generalized across Europe during the war. And on one level, the development of welfare states after 1945 reflected forms of solidarity between different social groups that had taken shape during the war. It's often argued, and I think this is quite plausible, that the Second World War was a war that imposed generalized risks upon societies because civilians became extremely vulnerable to warfare in a way that had not previously been common, at least not for a long time. So there tended to be a form of collective risk management that developed out of the Second World War. But also in the immediate aftermath of the war, welfare states were developed in the context of the Cold War as a means of counteracting or reducing the appeal of communism, of the Soviet system in Western Europe. So even after the end of the Second World War, international conflict was a very, very strong driver of welfare reform and the construction of social rights. But at this time, I would like to say that it's very distinctive that the construction of social rights also became separated from war. That whereas historically warfare had driven the development of welfare states, after 1945, the impact of war on welfare provision became weaker. And this is not uniformly the case. I mean, if we look at Vietnam, for example, the Vietnam War in America, this coincided with a dramatic expansion in welfare funding in the USA. So there was always a correlation. In fact, the US Army is still an important welfare provider today, still an important source of welfare. But very importantly, societies began to develop welfare states in which recognition of welfare duties was less strongly associated with experiences of war. So that societies that had not been independent during the period, during the Second World War, began to construct welfare systems. Obviously, welfare systems began to develop a much more uniform reach, so that social welfare rights were distributed to social groups that had not been connected with war. Women became much more strongly integrated into welfare systems, although they were not, didn't generally serve as soldiers. And the universalization of welfare, which became a feature of some societies, not all societies, but became a feature of some welfare states at this time, marked, I would say, a very important shift in the development of modern constitutional law and in the social impact of modern constitutional law as welfare became universal. So to conclude, we could say that on one hand, the basic structure of national constitutions after 1945 resulted from war and from experiences of social militarization. But it also became separated from war at the same time. So there's a differentiation between the constitutional system and the military system, which takes place at this time. And I think that this is the secret of constitutional democracy. I think that this is the trick. This is something that happened at this time, and it might not have been even strategically designed, but there was a process in which the role of constitutions in organizing society, in channeling social integration, moved away from warfare with all its attendant risks towards welfare. Welfare developed within the military system, but it became separate from the military system at the same time. I think this is the foundation of constitutional democracy. It's not even, it's only implicit in constitutional law itself. But if we think about constitutions in a more holistic way, this is what happened at this time, I would say. Now, when we come to the next wave constitution making, when constitutionalism really became a global form in the 1980s, we see something rather different. And again, I think this is a fact of extraordinarily far-reaching importance for constitutional analysis, but it's very rarely recognized, which is that the constitutions created in the 1980s in Latin America, or from the 1980s onwards, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and some parts of Africa, were the first constitutions that had been created without warfare. It's the first time it ever happened that there was a wave, a large-scale wave of constitution making in which the pressure that drove the creation of constitutions was not war. Now, of course, military actors were involved in these processes. We very clearly, most Latin American constitutions developed in the context of a transition away from military government. Not all of them, but many of them. And in Eastern Europe, constitutions were created in an environment that was shaped by the decline, the disappearance of political parties that had some form of military support. Eastern European governments were not military dictatorships in the way that many Latin American governments were, but they were party dictatorships in which the party interlocked very closely with military units. But there were not many constitutions at this time that were actually created through military conflict. I mean, the Colombian Constitution of 1991 is an exception to this. The Colombian Constitution is in some way a military contract between different parts, or at least some form of peace agreement between different units in society. In some ways, the South African Constitution that was created incrementally through the 1990s can be seen, can be aligned to the typology that I was setting out before. But most constitutions were created through a movement away from military rule in which society itself wasn't militarized. So the militarization of society that characterized earlier constitutions became less significant. Now, we can speculatively say that this new form of constitution making without war, relied on a new form of normative system, and that it relied very strongly on the rise of international human rights law. And international actors and the promotion of international norms played a very important role in transitions in Eastern Europe and Latin America, Argentina in particular, and Colombia as well, but I think in Brazil perhaps to a lesser degree. And in this process, international human rights law began to form a normative order in which different social groups could establish a basic working consensus for the construction of democratic constitutional orders. And in some ways, this replaced warfare as a driver of constitution making. So international pressures still impacted on constitution making situations, but without this military impetus. But this creates a framework in which we can interpret constitutional problems in some post-1980s democratic constitutional systems. In that, at one level, the limited impact of war on constitution making was extremely beneficial in that it meant that democratic transitions could be conducted without large numbers of casualties, except in Colombia. It meant that democratic institutions could be stabilized very quickly. And of course, it meant, for example, that the Soviet Union could dissolve after 1991 with almost no warfare. There were some small military conflicts during the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union was a huge territorial bloc, but it dissolved extraordinarily peacefully if we compare it with the collapse of earlier empires. But At the same time, the fact that constitutions at this time were created without warfare had certain longer term implications that might allow us to explain democratic instability in some societies. Now, at one level, the fact that international actors and international norms played such an important role during the transitions of the 1980s meant that constitutions could be created by elites through, Chile is the classical example of this, by inter-elite interactions, so that the actual mobilization of society for to create constitutional law was relatively weak. Governments were less reliant on legitimacy extracted from their own populations. They could legitimate themselves by extracting justification for transition from an international normative system. But I think most importantly, we could see that during this time, this was not only the first moment in history that we see, or in modern history that we see transition to democracy without war. It's the first period where we see transition to democracy without the construction of welfare states. In the previous models, previous waves of democratic transition on a constitutional basis had increased welfare expenditure, increased social rights. But this didn't happen in the 1980s. Now, we've got to be very careful in making this argument, because in Latin America, welfare states in some cases were constructed later. So 20 years later in Brazil and Argentina, and to a lesser degree, perhaps in Chile, a process of welfare state construction began. It wasn't finished, but it began in peacetime. And this is historically also a very important phenomenon. But generally speaking, we can say that whereas the democratic transitions after 1945 had taken place within a welfare state revolution, after the democratic transitions in the 1980s took place without a welfare state revolution. So paradoxically, we can say that we might be able to, it's just a speculative observation, but paradoxically, we might observe that the process of democratic transition, constitution making in the 1980s, both had the benefits of the absence of warfare, but it also experienced disadvantages because of the absence of warfare, because the legitimational foundations of constitutional law based in the creation of welfare states were not very strong, were not as strong as in post-1945 Europe. And in many democracies, constitutional systems created at this time, we can see 2 points. We can see 2 phenomena. One is that the welfare state structures are relatively weak, but we can also say that they remain very deeply contested. So that some post-1980s democracies polarize very profoundly around welfare commitments. And this is not exclusive to constitutional systems created in the 1980s. You can obviously see something very similar in the USA, and to some degree, you can see something similar in Great Britain, in the UK. But this phenomenon, this polarization around welfare, is more pronounced in constitutional systems created after the 1980s, where welfare agreements are less strongly embedded. And in extreme cases, of course, we can see examples where the weak consolidation of social rights is accompanied by the fact that military units that existed during dictatorships are not completely discredited because there was no war. And in some instances, we can see states where the remnants of military units established in authoritarian systems are prepared to mobilize to destroy welfare states. They're prepared to mobilize against the social aspect of constitutional law. So the point that I made earlier, which is that the secret of constitutional law, the democratic secret of constitutional law, is that it reorients social integration from the military to the welfare state, is always fragile. It's fragile in every society. And it can always be unstitched. But there are some societies, I would say, where this danger is very acute, where we see an integrational shift away from the welfare state back to the military. And this is the balance, I think, that underlies constitutional law. You have to look hard to see it because it's just beneath the text of the Constitution. But most constitutions originate as forms of military integration, and they develop into forms of welfare integration, but they can always go back. I mean, the USA, of course, is an important example of this, where there was an attempted coup d'etat not very long ago, and this is against the background of a very, what is now a weak welfare state. And you can think of other examples yourselves, I'm sure. But just as a concluding point, then, I'd like to say that to understand constitutional law, what it does in society, what its effects are, we can observe that constitutions are dialectically produced by war. That until the 1980s, they grew out of warfare. But the ability of constitutions to frame democratic government depends on their ability to move societies away from war, to pacify society, whilst at the same time retaining some form of foundation in solidarities created by warfare. And as I said before, the deep secret of constitutional law, seen as a democratic way of organizing government, is that they moved social integration from the military to the welfare state. But this is not a finished process. It's not a social process that is terminated. It can always be reversed. And where we look across the globe today and see societies which disinvest in welfare systems, almost invariably, we see the re-emergence of some pattern of social militarization, whether it's through violent conflict between social groups or between the increasingly hegemonic role of the actual regular army. It takes place in different ways, but this is an almost invariable outcome of the derecognition of social rights as an essential part of constitutional law. And this process, I would say, is not exclusive to constitutions created in the 1980s, but it's particularly prominent in these environments. I've spoken for an hour, so I'm going to stop. But thank you for all of us. But thank you very much for listening. And
thank you, Professor Chris. Thank you, Chris, for this enlightening lecture. I think we got very interesting insights here from you. I found it particularly interesting, this military paradox of constitutions that you addressed in your speech, because it was not always clear for me that it was the driving force, and then at the same time, constitutions need to frame military power in order to gain stability. And I think this is a key issue because it addresses the key point of constitutions, this moment of decision, of political violence, and creating of legal orders. So this is truly interesting, and I would like, if I may, just sure, ask you for a quick comments on 2 points. One of them, connecting with your final remarks, because after the crisis of the welfare state, because if I got it right, what you say is the first wave of constitutions. It was driven by warfare. Then it was the second wave replaced as the driving force of constitutions by welfare. And with the crisis of the welfare state and downsizing and the replacing of the social budget for military budget again, if you don't have this turn back, especially with Reagan administration, back to warfare, but not inside the country but outside, international. And this leads to another question. That is the second wave, when constitutions were not made by war, but by welfare, that is without disruption, but with transition, smooth transition. That lights up a point that is this authoritarian tamed transition to democracy, especially in Latin America and Brazil. There's some studies that say that it was a halfway transition to democracy. So then you end up with the problem of what to do with the military force within your borders. And to what extent this not constitutes a risk to democracy? Because if you cannot, without militarizing society, if you cannot give a democratic function to the military, then it can bite its own tail, so to speak. So I would like to hear from you just quick comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I could just clarify a point. I'm sorry that if I didn't make this as clear as I wished. When I talk about these two periods of constitution making, my first claim is that there were many attempts at constitution making before 1945. There were many attempts to create constitutional democracy, but almost without exception, they didn't work. So that before 1945, democracies were either collapsed through civil conflict, resulting in authoritarianism, or they collapsed through external military intervention, or some combination of the two. Okay. The only unbroken democracies, if we take my definition of a democracy as a constitutional system in which everybody can vote, men and women, and they have equal voting rights in competitive elections. The number of democracies that were unbroken before 1945 is tiny. Sweden, New Zealand, that's probably all, but we might say Finland and Ireland. That's it. The USA was not a democracy because it was an apartheid system. The percentage of non-Caucasian males in the southern states of America who could vote before 1965 is very small. So this is an apartheid system in the same way that South Africa was, essentially. In Britain's a peculiar case, but in Britain had a system of plural voting until 1950 in which some people could vote more than once. Anyway, but my first claim is that there was a wave of democratic construction after 1945, which over the course of about 20 years became quite robust. So democracies became quite stabilized, usually in the north of Europe. And this coincided with the creation of welfare states. So democracies didn't develop before welfare states, they developed at the same time. It's not really separate processes. And the secret behind this is that welfare states developed in a way that they were created by warfare, through solidarities constructed through warfare, but they moved society away from war, they pacified society at the same time. Then there's a second wave of transition in the 1980s, and this took place in a different way, and this mainly applies to Latin America and Eastern Europe, but some cases in Africa as well. The construction of constitutional systems at this time didn't take place during warfare. And one result of this is that militaries were not completely discredited in the way that they were in many European countries, particularly in the more authoritarian countries. But a second result of this was that in most cases, there occurred a transition to democracy which was organized and legitimated around an international constellation. But the basic domestic substructure of constitutional democracy, the welfare state, wasn't created. I mean, in much of Eastern Europe, there was actually a reduction in welfare spending through the transition to democracy. In Latin America, it's variable. Chile democratized and with a stronger welfare state. Other countries suffered a reduction in welfare spending. So there are variations. But the relationship, the simultaneity of democratic construction and welfare construction, welfare state construction that took place after 1945 didn't take place in the 1980s. And now, I think that this relates to your second question, which is what happens in situations of this kind, what happens to the army? In Europe after 1945, military spending in some countries, at least for a period of time, remained relatively high, but welfare spending increased dramatically. So the relationship between welfare spending and military spending changed very substantially compared to periods of forms of social spending before 1945. After the 1980s, military spending declined in most transitional countries. I mean, Brazil is a bit of an exception, and military spending remains relatively high as far as I understand it. This raises a slightly different question of what happens to the army in situations of this kind, where there is a transition without warfare, and there is a transition that doesn't fundamentally renegotiate the position of the military in society. And I think that this depends on a number of different variables. And it's very difficult to provide a key answer to this, because there isn't a constitutional norm which will, given that the role of the army is the most volatile aspect of constitutional law through its entire history, there isn't simply one rule to resolve this question. But I do think that we can see certain social variables which help us to explain ways in which some societies experience transitions of this kind reduce the position of the army quite dramatically, and some societies didn't. And I would say, as an immediate response, it depends on the volatility of territorial borders. This is a very important determinant, because let's say, well, in Eastern Europe at the moment, we can see that territorial borders have become very contested, and this has a dramatic impact on the role of the army. And it has a dramatic impact on the stability of democracy. In the societies that are contiguous or in the same geopolitical space as the conflict in the Ukraine, usually are in the process of very rapidly becoming less democratic. And the army and the militarization of society is increasing. But Brazil is an interesting case of this. And, you know, I defer to your expertise, of course. I claim no profound understanding of this. But it would seem to me that Brazil has an uncertain territorial region, which is very militarized. And the Amazonian border it would seem to me, as far as I can judge, a very militarized and militarily contested space within Brazilian society. And this, not through interstate military conflict, but through other forms of lower level military conflict. And this obviously means that the army is a politically relevant actor in the social administration of territory. A different example is Colombia, of course, where there's been a persistent low-level civil war for a long period of time, but this affects the role of the military in Colombia in a very different way, because the Colombian army historically is very weak. And it's only really in the last 2 decades that the Colombian army has become a powerful stabilizing actor. So there isn't really one model that fits all of this, but I would say territorial uncertainty of different kinds is almost inevitably a factor that affects the role of the army within the state, and which is likely to make democracy less secure. These are just improvised responses to your question. What I would say at a more fundamental level is that we don't really have examples of democratic systems that have stabilized without welfare states. We don't really. There are, I mean, obviously some democracies have strong welfare states and some have weak welfare states. USA has a relatively weak welfare state. It's not as weak as people say, but it's a relatively weak welfare state. Germany and Scandinavia have relatively strong welfare states, very strong in Scandinavia. And there might be another way of constructing stable democracies, but we've never been able to do it. And a secondary pattern that we see in this process is that the reduction of the welfare aspect of the Constitution. Welfare is not always constitutionalized, but it's part of a constitutional order. And whenever we see depletion of welfare states, I mean, I wouldn't really connect this with the Reaganite period. I would see this as being more recent. I would see that in many areas, the depletion of welfare states really takes place after 2008. It's really after the financial crisis, not everywhere, for outliers. But the depletion of welfare states usually leads to some form of militarization, whether it's an increasing role for the regular army, or whether it's increasing conflict within society. And these two processes are not usually totally separate from each other. I mean, I leave you to make the argument about Brazil, but I think there's an argument that would be constructed around Brazil in this case. But so it's quite a long answer to a question, and some of what I say about territorial integrity is rather improvised, because again, we don't have a standard model for explaining this.
Okay, thank you, Chris. It was a very rich evening. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Quero agradecer, ministro. Passo a palavra para agradecer o final.
Bastante instigante, são realidades que também são muito próximas. Já a origem, por exemplo, sobre a nossa Constituição, tem a República, nosso forte protagonismo militar. Relevante a respeito do esforço que a doutrina faz. Nós temos uma campanha em 1910, aqui na agenda do Brasil, hoje, de propósito, quer dizer, a campanha civilista, né? Tanto, mais uma vez, um general, um marechal, ou candidatos, né? Então, isso é um dado importante. Claro, depois tivemos todas essas crises que são bastante conhecidas. Creio que também a abordagem sobre a necessidade do Estado social é bastante relevante. E nós tivemos aqui, inclusive, do Estado social, até mesmo dentro de um contexto ditatorial. O Vargas um pouco faz isso, né? Enfatiza sociais e assume esse papel chamado mais dos lobos, né? Mas calcado também forte aparato militar. Né? Depois vamos ter este outro movimento dentro da dos anos 80, especialmente na Constituição 88, né? Até com grande ênfase dos atores sociais, sindicatos fortes, reconhecimento desses vários direitos que vão enfatizar Bolsa Família. É claro que não é o state, a moda europeia, é claro que é dentro das nossas limitações, mas, de certa forma, modo de enfatização e de reconhecimento de cidadania. De modo que acho que é uma abordagem bastante interessante. De quando em vez nós temos tido debate no Constitucional sobre o papel das Forças Armadas, né, especialmente a interpretação da 142, né, da Constituição, que alguns dizem corresponderia até mesmo a um moderador, um pouco voltando para aquela questão que o senhor colocou. Eu acho extremamente útil essa abordagem e vai ser muito estimulante para os nossos alunos a partir dessa perspectiva. Né? No Brasil, algumas pessoas chegam a nos criticar por termos feito uma transição pacífica e não termos tão radicais com os militares, temos celebrado uma lei de anistia. Eu não estou certo disto. Nossos outros países, nossos vizinhos, trilharam talvez um outro caminho, também não lograram a necessária estabilidade. São debates que não se encerram, mas, em suma, eu acho importante esse diálogo e agradeço por essa noite.
Obrigado, Ministro.
Can I
Chris, final remarks.
just final comment? Thank you so much for this this commentary. It's extremely helpful. I mean, one question just to leave everybody with, and one final observation. The correlation between, I often think about the correlation between social rights during the Vargas period, pre-1945, and the role of the military. But I don't think that this contradicts my argument, because the full implementation of the system of social rights was at the end of the dictatorial period. It's in the labor law code, so it's in 1943, isn't it? Yeah. So it actually provides provides an example of what I'm describing. The construction of a welfare state actually provided a basis for a transition to a society which was much more not completely democratic, but much more democratic. And then, with regard to the contemporary welfare state and and family subsidies and so on, I'd like to be absolutely clear about it. I mean, it should be clear from what I'm saying anyway. I'd like to be absolutely clear that I feel the greatest admiration for the processes of welfare state construction that have taken place in Brazil. There can be absolutely no doubt about this, particularly under the Lula government. But the point that I'm making is that welfare state construction, not only in Brazil, but also in Argentina and in Chile, it took place after substantially later than the process of transition. And of course, the remnants of an authoritarian welfare state remained in place during the transition as well. But really, the design of the welfare state was almost 20 years after the transition itself. It wasn't fundamental to the transition in that same way. But I really hope this is clear. I'm not saying that there is no welfare state tradition in Brazil, just the opposite. But just that it was disconnected from the democratic transition in some ways. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Obrigado, Ministro Gilmar, pela presença. Agradeço todas e todos aqui. E o professor Chris tem os livros ali na porta, vai estar por lá para autografar. Fiquem à vontade. Obrigado a todas.
Eu só queria ler uma mensagem.
Ah, sim. Imenso agradecimento ao criar a interlocução entre ordens e experiências diversas e também a viabilizar a criação de inúmeras pontes de diálogo entre saberes dos juristas e os saberes circundantes, como a filosofia, a sociologia, a psicologia, a economia, a história. Fiquei imensamente satisfeito por seu amado projeto e traduz atos de elevada generosidade para mim, honrado pelo alto privilégio que foi concedido para mim e aí ele então agradece essa iniciativa e eu queria deixar esse registro.
Oh, so kind. So kind. I'm so touched. Can we go on to the final slide at all? I wanted to go to the last slide there. There. Is that okay? Thank you.